So before we get started with our national championship, I wanted to quickly thank the many people who have made this evening possible. Tonight is the culmination of a series of competitions across the country that began in February of this year in Austin, Texas. Our regional host for that initial event, Ms. Kirsten Nash from Hendrickson High School, is here, so we just wanted to thank you for being here tonight and for kicking that event off. We also wanted to thank the hosts of our regional competitions that include in LA, California. It was hosted at Notre Dame High School by Ms. Christina Tulungen. In Independence, Missouri, hosted by Christine Adams at Truman High School. And Christine is here tonight, and thank you and welcome. In Washington, D.C., hosted by Julian Dotson at Metro D.C. Debate. And in New York, hosted by Brother John McGrory of Chaminade High School. And Brother John is here as well, so thank you so much for coming. I want to thank all of our regional partners, and a special thank you to Dino Pape, who ran our tab room today. Thank you so much for coming out here. Dino is the membership manager for the National Speech and Debate Association, as well as the head debate coach at Simpson College in Iowa. We also held an online competition open to students from all across the country, and partnered with the NSDA and the National Association for Urban Debate League to bring together 16 of the most talented speech and debate students in the country. So thank you to all of our wonderful partners and to the students, coaches, and parents who made today possible. In addition, I'd like to thank the generous sponsors whose financial support has made this competition possible. So thank you to our friends at the Winsong Trust. Your support of these programs is certainly appreciated and provides wonderful opportunities for students across the country. So in just a few minutes, the two competitors left standing will take the stage and compete for the right to be named the next great communicator. But before I bring them up, I want to provide a little bit of context for this event to our audience, and I thought the best way to do that was to share a story from President Reagan. Those of you who've been here, we've had a retreat over the course of the week, and I've shared several of these, and I think you might like this one. So President Reagan had a friend, a guy by the name of Danny Villanueva. And Danny Villanueva used to be a place kicker for the LA Rams. Not the current iteration of the LA Rams, but they were in LA. They moved to St. Louis for a while. They came back in LA again. After his career with the LA Rams, he went on and became a sports announcer. And one night he was having dinner at the home of a young baseball player who played for the Dodgers. And the young wife was in the background, hustling around making dinner for everyone. And they had a young baby. And the baby started to cry. And so the wife, who was making dinner, kind of looks over her shoulder and says to her husband, "Change the baby." And so, this is a young ball player. He was sitting next to a sports announcer and a local legend, and he felt a little bit embarrassed that his wife had told him to change the baby. And he said, "What do you mean change the baby? I'm a ball player. That's not my line of work." And she turned around, and she put her hands on her hips, and she communicated. She said, "Look, Buster, lay the diaper out like a diamond. You put second base on home plate. You put the baby's bottom on the pitcher's mound. You hook up first base, third base, slide home underneath. And if it starts to rain, the game's not over. You start all over again." So effective communication is something that has always been the hallmark of democracy, whether the printing presses of the Revolution, the famed public debates of Lincoln and Douglas, President Roosevelt's fireside chats, the inaugural speeches of President Kennedy, the use of television to reach broad audiences and sway legislation by President Reagan, and now with mobile phones and social media, any one of us has such a powerful communication tool in our pocket. It's unseen in the history of mankind. But to borrow from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. From the presidents to Spider-Man. So here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, this is our mission: to develop proactive, informed, educated, and conscientious citizens and leaders, to help develop the very sorts of informed and responsible students and citizens you'll hear from in just a few minutes. So in 1988, President Reagan was speaking to the nation, and he said this: "Since the founding of this nation, education and democracy have gone hand in hand. Thomas Jefferson not only wrote the Declaration of Independence and served as our third president, but also founded one of our most distinguished institutions of higher learning, the University of Virginia. Jefferson and the founders believed that a nation that governs itself, like ours, must rely on an informed and engaged electorate." And I don't know if there's a better academic or extracurricular activity than speech and debate when it comes to preparing students to embrace the responsibilities of citizenship. Some of the most thoughtful, well-educated, informed, and articulate people I've met in the course of my 7 years here at the Foundation just happen to be teenagers who are involved in speech and debate. So despite the communication challenges we face on a daily basis, you'll soon see a great example of why I, for one, am very optimistic about the future both of our country and of communication. So our 16 finalists have been debating all day, and now we're down to the final two. The stakes are high. So one of the two people who's coming up on stage in just a few minutes is going to win a $10,000 scholarship. Could you imagine $10,000 in about 30 minutes? That's not a bad investment of time, right? So for those of you who might not be familiar with academic debate, and because you're going to be a voting part of our judging panel, I want to point out a few differences from debates you may have seen on TV in the last presidential election cycle. Based on what I've seen from our competitors, I have a feeling they could hold their own in that arena. But first, I want to let you know that unlike presidential candidates, our students tonight are not coming into this with a hardcore forged opinion. Right now, as they sit there, they don't know which side of the debate they're going to be doing. In just a few minutes, we're going to flip a coin, so they won't know till they come up here, which is a little bit different than most presidential candidates. So we're going to flip a coin. Each one will decide which one they're going to represent. And so whether you're one of our official judges or if you're trying to determine the winner from your seat here in the pavilion, we ask that you put your personal opinion, so you might have a very strong opinion on this. We're going to ask you over the course of this next 30 minutes or so to put that to the side and really focus on who do you think makes the better argument, makes the better connection with you as an audience member, with you as a judge. On your seats, you should have received a judging guide, and I think you saw the judging video. It talks about the timing of the debate and what it is that's going on. Those of us who work on a daily basis in the house the great communicator built that knows that there's a beauty and that there's a resonance and that there's a power in effective communication. And this is what I'm asking you to look for in tonight's competitors. And I ask you to look for this because tonight you're going to play an important role in selecting our national champion. And because the next great communicator should be able to sway a crowd through the power of his or her voice and his or her communication, you'll get a chance to vote using your smartphone. We talked a little bit about that, and we'll give you more details at the end of the round. So before I introduce you to the two finalists, I want to introduce the rest of our final round judging panel. So in addition to you, the audience, the people, and myself, we are privileged to have the following. First, we have Miss Kate Kleinle. Kate is a rising sophomore studying philosophy, politics, economics, and sociology at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. She was the champion of last year's Great Communicator debate, and she's thrilled to return to the library this summer as an intern and help foster the same great environment she experienced last year. In addition to debating, she also loves art, philosophy, and hiking, and after college, she is looking to pursue a career in counterterrorism. So if there's any terrorists, watch out. She's going to get you. Our next judge is someone who has an insider's perspective on what it means to be a great communicator. She joined the Reagan-Bush re-election campaign in 1984, was recruited to work in the Office of Presidential Advance. She was in Berlin to hear President Reagan ask Secretary Gorbachev to tear down this wall. President Reagan's former chief of staff and the current chief administrative officer here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, Ms. Joanne Drake. And finally, our head judge and speaker this evening, Mary McMurray. Mary McMurray is the Director of Learning and Engagement for the Truman Library Institute in Independence, Missouri. She is a passionate educator and PhD-level historian on a mission to empower, engage, and inspire people to participate in our democracy. And she's going to share some of that work a little bit later by sharing the lessons of history. Previously, she served as the second director of the White House Decision Center at the Truman Library, a history instructor at the University of Kansas and the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and the program manager of Children and Youth in History. And now the moment we've all been waiting for, our finalists. So please join me on stage. We have two outstanding finalists. First, we have John Magloire. And our second finalist is Sriyash Upadhyay. So to determine which side they are going to be, I'm going to ask Mary McMurray to flip a coin. We have a commemorative Ronald Reagan coin, which I assure you is beautiful and wonderful. And she is going to flip it, and I'm going to ask John to call. He called tails, and it is?
Tails.
It is tails.
I will negate.
He will negate, which means you will be the AF. And with that, we will get started.
It is tempting to think that this debate is just about the value of social media. It is not. This debate is about the values of our democracy. It is the aim of our nation, and in fact of any democracy, to have a government of, by, and for the people. The strength of any democracy can be measured with one simple question: does the government represent the people? So today's debate is not between two people, but between two worlds. One with social media and one without. I urge you to cast your ballot today for the world in which the government might better represent its people. I contend that a world with social media is the only one in which the voices of the people can be heard, because it would otherwise be blotted out by the voices of corporations. A Princeton University study aimed to quantify how well our government represents the people by comparing nearly 2,000 public opinion surveys to the policies that ended up becoming law. In other words, they compared what the people wanted with what the government did. To quote their findings, the preferences of the average American appear to only have a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on policy. However, if you look at the preferences of the wealthiest 10% of Americans, the fit to policies passed is nearly perfect. This is because corruption is legal in America. Getting elected requires money. In fact, in 91% of elections, the candidate with more money wins. So when companies are allowed to finance campaigns and give lucrative job offers to our representatives through lobbyists, the people we elect are more beholden to special interests than they are to the common good. The result of this is clear. The 200 most politically active companies have spent $5.8 billion influencing our government. In return, they received $4.4 trillion in taxpayer support. As of today, there is only one effective way to raise money and political awareness that bypasses this corruption: social media. You see, the reason politicians raise money is to make phone calls, to run TV ads, and to knock on doors. So while it's easy to pretend that social media is only about socializing, today Twitter has replaced telephone calls, YouTube has replaced television, and Facebook has replaced the front porch. I can reach out to millions of people nearly for free from an office in Vermont, and each of those people could make a $27 donation, and our democracy could be freed from the shackles of corruption at last. Of course, we weren't quite that lucky this election cycle, but Bernie Sanders shows that a non-corrupt campaign can be viable because of social media. And his defeat doesn't mean that social media has been ineffective at eliciting democratic change. Democracy doesn't happen once every 4 years. It is a constant process involving every level of government. That's why it's important to look at the successes wrought by social media on the local level. Thousands of local leaders have used social media to root out corruption in our towns and cities. That's why, according to the National League of Cities, more than 85% of local governments use social media to disseminate information to their communities. In power, these tech-savvy leaders use social media to fight corruption by communicating with constituents, increasing government transparency and accountability. This is particularly important because those using social media tend to be younger, more diverse, and lower income than the average voter. In short, we are bringing more people into the democratic process and encouraging young leadership. Now, these might seem like small gains at first. It's hard to pay attention to local government when so much is going on at the federal level. But the local level is where all change starts. The way for federal anti-corruption laws was paved in the 1900s by taking down political machines like Tammany Hall in the 1800s. Separate but equal was struck down in the Supreme Court only after we overcame racist barons in the South. And large-scale anti-corruption reforms are only possible after tackling corruption on the local level. In fact, it's already happening. Represent.us, a social media-focused anti-corruption organization, recently passed our nation's first statewide anti-corruption legislation in South Dakota. Now, returning to a government of, by, and for the people, not the billionaires and giant corporations, will not be easy. And I admit it cannot be accomplished with social media alone. But when we have the most expensive healthcare in the world, and our tax code is a complete mess, when our nation is plagued with wasteful spending, a floundering education system, and a catastrophic drug war, when 1 in 5 Americans is born into poverty, and each generation is less likely to escape it than the last, when the American dream is dying because there is disproportionate power in the hands of a wealthy elite, we must fight for our democracy, and we must embrace social media as the most powerful way of doing so. That is why I proudly stand to affirm the resolution.
Is everybody ready? In 1807, Thomas Jefferson stated, "He who knows nothing is nearer to the truth than he whose mind is filled with falsehoods and errors." Because I agree with Jefferson, I negate the resolution. Social media strengthens American democracy. My first point is that social media disseminates inaccurate and unreliable information. Social media has become an increasingly popular source for news, especially among younger audiences. According to a Pew Research Center survey conducted in January, 35% of respondents between ages 18 and 29 said that social media was the most helpful source of information about the presidential campaign. Additionally, recent data from YouGov profiles reveals that adults aged 18 to 34 are now more likely to say that social media networks, as opposed to television, are their primary source of news. However, this reliance on social media is to young voters' detriment because social media is a breeding ground for inaccurate information. A CNN tech study found that more than 1/3 of the top 200 stories on social media about the 2 major US presidential candidates were from fake news sites during the 2 months before the 2016 presidential election. Just think about it. How many times have you seen posts on Facebook that you know to be factually wrong? This becomes even more frightening when coupled with the fact that Americans increasingly trust news that they find on social media. Everett Rogers of the Free Press reports that that information shared on online social networks, such as friends and family members, have a stronger persuasive influence on users. As individuals trust information circulated through their personal networks, this lessens the need for information verification. The social media user thus has the luxury of laziness, expending very little effort to learn about politics. Thus, social media is extremely bad for democracy, as more and more Americans believe inaccurate information without verifying it. Jason Brennan, professor of political science at Brown University, argues that misinformed choices at the ballot box have harmful consequences for society as a whole, because we're all forced to live with those consequences. Brennan says that a misinformed voter is analogous to a drunk driver. Just as a drunk driver cannot drive well, a misinformed voter cannot vote well. And think about this in your personal lives. How would you feel if an election was swayed just by the fact that people were receiving misinformation? My second point is that social media inhibits exposure to diverse ideas. Exposure to a diversity of ideas is crucial to a functioning democracy. The Association of American Colleges and Universities stresses this idea, writing, "The ability to learn and engage from perspectives and experiences different from one's own is a crucial catalyst for intellectual and moral growth. Enhancing one's knowledge by attending seriously to differing perspectives and developing respect for others' views is a bedrock element of a diverse democracy." Unfortunately, social media inhibits perspective taking and the challenging of ideas. While we may all have friends from different political stripes on social media, it doesn't necessarily mean we'll read the information that they provide us. This is extremely bad, because according to CNN Tech, articles gain traction on Facebook thanks to the filter bubble, a phenomenon where Facebook shows you more and more of what you like, creating a confirmation bias for your worldview. ZDNet reports that Facebook's algorithm will ensure that you read shared news from viewpoints similar to your own. Your feedback loop is in essence self-curated based on what you actually like. And if you don't like what your friends are sharing, you can unfollow and unfriend them, thus whittling down the echo chamber to an even smaller sample size. In essence, social media is just a mechanism by which Americans can artificially verify their own worldviews without ever being exposed to opposing viewpoints. My third point is that social media undermines civil discourse. In today's already polarized climate, we should be doing everything we can to create a more amicable political environment. However, social media is actually contributing to a more polarized democracy. In fact, according to the Pew Research Center, roughly half of social media users feel the political conversations they see on social media are angrier, less respectful, and less civil than those in other areas of life. This has led to less political participation, as Richard Davis of Oxford found that online interaction has been shown to contain elements of flaming, vitriolic language that discourage participation among a wide audience and harm the potential for deliberative democracy. To conclude, because social media leads to a coarsening of discourse and a dissemination of inaccurate information, I strongly believe that social media is detrimental to American democracy. Thank you.
Judges ready? Cool. The basis of the negating argument here is essentially that social media spreads fake news and increases polarization. But the data simply doesn't support this assertion. See, yes, there is some inaccurate and unreliable news on social media, but if, as my opponent states, this is the primary cause of polarization in the United States, we'd expect certain things to happen. As he noted, the majority of social media users are young. Young people disproportionately use social media. I can tell you that myself. And so, if social media is the real cause of polarization in the United States, we'd expect those young people to be more polarized. However, a study from the National Bureau of Economic Research seems to indicate the opposite. For every measure of polarization, except religious polarization, we see that the oldest age groups experience larger changes in polarization than those younger than they. That kind of finding is difficult to square with the notion that social media is the cause of political polarization. So, we are brought to question, what really is then? What is the cause of polarization? And how is the extent of polarization in the United States today? Because, you know, our politicians aren't polarized on all issues. There are certain things which have had bipartisan support in recent years. If we go back to the 2007-2008 financial crisis, you note that there was bipartisan support for legislation which essentially provided a free ride for those corporations which crushed our economy. While the taxpayers were bailing them out, they had to pay us nothing in return. And sure, certain laws were passed, like Dodd-Frank, which helped create anti-corruption measures. Let's look what happened to those anti-corruption measures. A key measure in Dodd-Frank was that politicians would have to disclose their financial information publicly, particularly their interests in stocks and other financial information. That bill was repealed under the Republican Congress in the Obama administration and was signed off by Obama. It's not like Republicans and Democrats can't agree on anything. It seems that our lawmakers can agree very well on those pieces of legislation which further corporate interests above those of the American people. In the end, that is the greatest problem our democracy faces today. We live in a country that no longer represents its people. That country is hardly a democracy, and every day we march further and further into a kind of oligarchy, where the wealthy control the discourse in this nation, where the wealthy fund campaigns and they control our politicians. Social media provides a means of fighting that, and it has been overwhelmingly effective. There are thousands of cities across the United States in which local leaders have begun to use social media to fight this kind of corruption. One of those is actually a town very near mine, Tacoma Park. See, the mayor there runs a blog which gives information as to what the city council is doing, how people can become civically engaged, especially how youth can work with government. And it is through that blog that our mayor is trying to foster civic engagement and youth leadership, the kind of leadership we need to fight for our democracy. And I'll tell you that this is a story being echoed across America. Whether it's in California or in DC, every state in the union has seen this kind of increase in youth participation and in local leadership. And as that leadership begins to translate to a federal level, we see the first state anti-corruption laws. We see the viability of a political candidate who is not controlled by the corporate elite. We see a shining beacon of hope. That hope is that one day we will not be ruled by a corporate class, that our politicians will work towards our interests in a real way, and it is only possible today because of social media.
I use 45 seconds. Is everybody ready? My opponent tries to give you this idea that the corrupt and the rich are basically controlling the United States of America, and the only way to combat that problem is through social media. And throughout this speech, I'm going to show you why that notion is untrue. First, let's start on the Princeton evidence, where my opponent talks about how, compared to what people want, the government did the opposite, except for the top 10%. There are a few problems with this. First, this is an inherent problem with our political system, not with social media. This is a problem with campaign finance, not with how we communicate about that corruption. So if you actually desire to solve this problem of corrupt campaigns, then we need to be talking about reforming campaign finance. But that's not what this debate is about. This entire problem that my opponent brings up throughout his case can be solved by a simple piece of legislation on the negative. Additionally, it's more likely to happen on the negative, as it will show you, because polarization increases in the affirmative side. So if we desire to actually create legislation that will ensure that campaign finance is no longer corrupt, then we should negate. But then my opponent talks about how social media can bypass this corruption, and how millions of people could make donations through social media. There are two problems with this. First, you don't actually make donations through social media. Social media, at best, solicits donations. It would direct you to another website to make donations. So we don't need social media to actually attract people to make donations. But secondly, my opponent makes a point, and he says that social media users are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And my question for everybody in the audience is if the majority of social media users are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, how are they going to have this amount of money to spend on more donations through social media? That seems to be a contradiction. How can these people who don't have extra money to spend be making these donations through social media? Then my opponent talks about how a majority of local municipalities have used social media to disseminate information. He never showed a net benefit of disseminating this information through social media. Essentially, what I'm saying is we can get this information out without social media, and he never shows you a reason why delivering this information through social media is in fact better. Now I'd like to address a couple of things that my opponent said against my case. First, he says that a majority of social media users are young, so young people should be less polarized than older people. And he says that is not actually the case in reality. But he's conflating two issues in my case. My first point does not talk about polarization. Rather, it talks about misinformed voters, which he doesn't address in his last speech. Essentially, the point that I am making is that as more people trust social media and do not verify their information, they become misinformed voters. This point is separate from the polarization point. I'm not talking about how people become more polarized. Rather, I'm talking about how people become misinformed voters, and he doesn't address that. But then let's go to my second point, which also goes unaddressed, and I think this is really important. I want everyone in the audience to ask yourself this question. Why do we have academic debates like this? The answer is because discourse is good for our democracy. Insofar as we have more discourse, we have better policies. But the evidence that I present in my second point shows you that social media actually destroys this discourse and makes people less likely to want to participate in their democracy. So if we are to value democracy and we want our democracy to function, we should negate the resolution, because social media actually creates a situation whereby people do not want to engage in political conversations. Finally, against the point about my last point about polarization, my opponent says that there was consensus in 2007 and 2008. But we can clearly see now, in 2017, polarization is worse than it's ever been, and there's a reason for that. I'm ready for crossfire.
So I believe as the affirmative, I get to ask the first question.
Yes.
All right. You've stated that misinformation is a very large problem and that the primary cause of this is the algorithms which underlie social media feeds, correct?
Well, actually, that's two separate arguments. The algorithm argument talks about how we actually don't get an exposure to a diversity of ideas. The algorithms that are in these social networks make it so that we only get information that we agree with, not a diversity of ideas. Whereas the other argument is that because people trust information on social media because their friends and family are sharing them, they're more likely to agree and believe this information, which leads to misinformed voters.
But if social media algorithms were to be able to check the veracity of news to make sure that it's all real, do you not then agree that we would be able to solve both of those problems?
That's actually a great question, and we tried this and it didn't work. For example, recently, Facebook tried to create an algorithm to make it so that fake news would not get through to people's news feeds. But according to CNN Tech, what actually ended up happening is all of these fake news articles with misleading headlines slipped through the cracks and still got on people's social media feeds. And that shows that these algorithms really cannot be changed. And whenever we try to change them, it's ineffective.
Actually, that brings me to the most fundamental question I wanted to ask. See, the CNN news report you're talking about occurred only slightly after the election. However, social media companies have made a large commitment to changing their algorithms. Google is already developing new algorithms to counter fake news, so are Twitter and Facebook. And I think that our engineers and our computer scientists are capable enough to be able to counter these issues. There's new technologies like machine learning that are constantly developing to check that news is not fake and to make sure that we're getting diverse opinions in our news feeds. If that is the case, then is this problem with social media not a much shorter term problem and a much lesser problem than the underlying problem of corruption which social media helps fight?
No, for two reasons. First of all, we have to evaluate why people actually enjoy using social media. When people go on social media, they like to see ideas and posts that they agree with. If we start changing the algorithms of social media to make it so that people see different types of views, if people don't actually want to see those types of views, they can do one of two things. First, they can stop using that social media network, or even if we do change the algorithms effectively, as you say, like I say in my case, these people can just block people who they don't agree with, which still creates the echo chamber that I talk about. I have a question for you. So you talk a lot about campaign finance and corruption. Isn't this an underlying problem with our political system?
I agree that it is an underlying problem with our political system, but the fundamental idea behind my case is the only effective way in which we have combated corruption in this century is using social media. And because this is the most fundamental problem with our democracy, if social media provides a solution to that problem, it is fundamentally strengthening it. And I believe that is time.
Yes.
So, moderator questions.
Is it on? Thank you. I guess my first question would go to the affirmative, and you clearly believe strongly, made a strong case today, and as did your opposition. What do you think is the strongest point they made, and how would you counter that?
I believe that the strongest point that my opponent made is that social media allows for people with similar ideas to come together. I think that's actually one of the bases of his echo chamber argument. But it's also the most fundamental part of combating corruption. It's only when like-minded people who have a common goal of solving the problems in our democracy, who have a common goal of rooting out corruption, come together that we can actually fight corruption. And so, it turns out one of the perhaps weaknesses that my opponent would say about social media is one of the greatest strengths in strengthening our democracy.
Same question to you.
I think the best point that my opponent makes is that corruption does in fact exist in our political environment, and then that's a problem, and we need to fix that. And I think he makes a really good point saying that it's inherently unfair that the top 10%, for example, are controlling the policy in America. But where we start to divert is how do we solve that problem? And what I am saying as the negative is the best way to solve that problem is through legislation, to regulate campaign finance. But you might ask yourself, what does that have to do with the negative advocacy? And the answer is quite simple. In order for legislation to get passed, there can't be hyperpolarization. Otherwise, no legislation will get passed. And my argument is the best way to eliminate polarization is to negate, and then we can implement legislation to solve all of the problems that my opponent brings up.
Both of you are extraordinary. So congratulations to getting to this point. I have two questions for both of you. The first one is, I want you to tell me which social media platform do you think is the most effective in our political environment and why?
Personally, I am a big fan of Facebook. I use Facebook more than I do other social media sources, and I also think that it allows for the most developed forms of discussion. While Twitter is good for making live commentary, it's kind of limited by its 140-character limit, and as such, we can have more developed political discussions on Facebook. However, I admit I am kind of biased as a user of that form of social media.
John?
I would also agree that my favorite form of social media would be Facebook, but I actually think it is the least effective out of all of them for one simple reason. Unlike other social media networks, Facebook allows you to share a vast variety of different types of media. For example, on Facebook, you can update your status and write a post. You can share a video, you can share a link. And so because of this vast amount of information that's coming into one database, into one place, all at the same time, that is basically the root cause of all this misinformation that we're getting. And I think Facebook is uniquely bad in that aspect because it allows all of this information to come together in one place at an extremely quick rate.
Okay, I've just changed my second question. In 140 characters or less, if you had the opportunity to tweet directly to the President of the United States, what would you say?
Fulfill your promise, root out corruption.
The presidency is not a game. Take it seriously.
Thank you both.
Okay, my first question is going to go to the affirmative. So one of the key arguments that I hear you saying is the idea that social media, and especially at the local level, gives the ability to increase transparency and accountability. So I guess my question is, if you look at, say, the social media accounts of a local government, how many followers they have, how many people are interacting on a daily basis, and you compare that to, say, a national political figure or a national media outlet. I mean, it's millions to maybe thousands, depending on how big that local municipality is. And I think that the counter to that argument might be, well, for these national figures or parties or news sources, that if they are sending out a message, whatever that message is, that it's going to have a lot more eyes, a lot more retweets, get a lot more action on social media. And if their desire is not to increase, transparency, if it's to spin. So, for example, you wake up every morning and watch the news, which is a depressing thing to do. Every day is a new crisis or a new outrage that has been started on social media somewhere, right? I mean, that's kind of the main. The traditional media has looked to social media as like the breaking source of almost all things news. So is it your contention that kind of comparing the impact of local versus federal government and national figures and that sort of thing, that we should find hope in kind of like the tidbits and the kernels of what's happening at the local, and how eventually does that translate to the national level?
Well, of course, local governments have fewer people in their jurisdictions. As such, they're bound to have fewer followers. It'd be kind of weird if the mayor of Tacoma Park had 27 million people following her. So it makes sense to me that there is, of course, less influence for any given local government's account. But we have to realize that there are thousands of local governments across the United States, and cumulatively they actually have a fairly large impact. And I think the key point here is that any real change in our democratic system comes from the local level. Grassroots movements are the key to the strength of democracy. And what we are doing in building up local support is making the way for federal change to occur. So while, yes, social media is still in its infancy and it's not fully developed and as such will not have its maximum impact today, local governments are showing the way, and they have only been increasing in their influence in the prior years. So once we start seeing greater involvement on the national level, which I'm sure will happen, as has followed in the past, then we will also see a greater impact on the federal level. But for now, we have to be content with that on the local level.
Okay, thank you. My second question is for the negative side. So one of the key arguments I hear you saying is that social media, it leads to a breakdown in discourse, which you're saying is a bad thing for democracy. It seems that one of the things we've seen, especially in the recent years, is that in some ways what's happening on social media and these arguments that are playing out in social media cause people to have very strong emotional reactions. And if we look at the history of what has caused great change in this country, often it comes from really strong emotions, and that it's not. Is it that social media is it destroying democracy through these strong emotions and people aren't talking to each other? Or I think you could also say, well, we're seeing more people taking to the streets. We're seeing more people take action. We're seeing more people who are, getting out and voting or supporting a candidate. So I'd just like to hear your reaction. Is it maybe not that it's breaking it down, but maybe it's causing more and more people to get involved in the democratic process?
So I would agree with you that in certain instances in the past, emotion has catalyzed change. We've seen that in the past several times. But this scenario is actually different, and I'll explain why. Unlike a positive emotion that somebody would get relating to something that would happen, which would motivate them to do something, social media gives such a negative connotation to politics and a political discussion. And this is part of the evidence that I read in my third point. And in fact, more than half of all social media users say that social media discourse is so disgusting and so vitriolic that it's even worse than some of the terrible discourse we see in real life. And that's when my next piece of evidence from Richard Davis of Oxford comes in. And he actually directly answers your question. And he says, as a result of this vitriolic language on social media, we've actually seen a decrease in voter participation because people are so disgusted with politics. They don't want to hear about it anymore. And I ask the audience, if you've ever seen a post on Facebook and you click on the comments section and scroll through it, you'll see oftentimes that the comments aren't substantive. They're ad hominem attacks. They're completely emotional reactions, or they're people arguing with each other, not on substance, but against each other. And so when you see that day after day, post after post, it makes you tired of politics, and people no longer want to put up with it, and that's why political participation decreases because of social media.
Okay, so I have two different questions for each of you. Both refer specifically to your cases. So Suryash, I'm going to start with you. You come up here and you bring us, in your opening statement, a really compelling argument about anti-corruption, giving the power to the people and reducing the hegemony of the 1%. However, the examples that you give us are Tammany Hall, the fall of Separate but Equal, and a few others, all of which happened before social media. However, you then tell us that we still have problems with corruption in the world of social media. Doesn't that prove, A, that it was possible to give the power back to the people in a world without social media, and B, that social media is not exceptionally effective in fighting the corporate hegemony that we see today?
Well, that first point, I think, is actually slightly misleading. Yes, it's possible to fight corruption, but it was much, much harder back then. And we're facing a fundamentally different kind of corruption. Corporations have only gotten more powerful in the American sphere today, and so it is important to have a more powerful tool to fight them. That's where social media comes in. And it's not that all my examples come from the past. That's simply in order to expand the examples which already occur in the present. As I stated, there are thousands of cities across the United States which are using social media to fight misinformation, to make government more accountable, and to fight corruption. Those governments should be the shining beacon of hope in a currently bleak and corrupt American democracy. And simultaneously, we are seeing this grow to the local level as we have seen in the, from the local level as we have seen in the past. Represent.us, a social media-based organization, was able to pass the first statewide anti-corruption law in the United States. If that is not a concrete impact of social media fighting against corruption, I do not know what is.
Awesome, thank you. Then John, so 100 or 200 years ago, if I wanted news, I probably only had enough time or money to either subscribe to one newspaper or walk down to the corner and buy a newspaper from my local newsboy, right? That means that that one newspaper was my only source of information. Why is that control of information worse than the bias that we, or not worse than the bias that we see under a world with social media?
Well, I certainly wouldn't say that it's not worse, but that's not the comparative analysis that I'm making. I would compare it to something like the mainstream media on TV or different newspapers, which are quite accessible and affordable today compared to in the past. And when we look at something like that, when we view different media sources, such as different newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the New York Post, and we evaluate all of those separately, we're getting different perspectives. There are different writers, there are different people coming up with those ideas. The problem with social media is twofold. First is the algorithm problem, as I discussed at length, which is that these algorithms make it so that you only get information that you agree with. But the second problem is specific to people themselves. And even if we fix the algorithms, as my opponent suggests, that doesn't solve the underlying problem, which is that if people don't like what they're seeing on social media, they can just block it. And that means they're creating an artificial echo chamber whereby they only hear ideas that they agree with.
Thank you.
Actually, I would like to know, to each of you, which side do you believe? John, why don't you go first?
I think that the neg has a lot of merit to it right now in the status quo. And I genuinely do believe that an echo chamber is a really big problem. And I'll be honest, when I open my Facebook feed, I see news stories from sources that I like. I do not see news stories from sources that I completely disagree with. And I think this is really a real-world problem that everyone in the audience probably experiences. And I think that is a really big problem, because if we're not exposed to different views, as I said earlier, if we don't have real discourse, it's impossible to have a functioning democracy. If I'm only reading things that I agree with, if I'm only seeing things that I agree with, and I'm never exposed to the other side, how can I be expected to form a different opinion or a better opinion? And I think at the end of the day, that's the fundamental problem with social media, coupled with the fact that it increases the likelihood that we see information that we disagree with. And I think even though social media is an extremely powerful tool, it's more times than not used for things that are extremely bad for democracy.
Personally, I am of the opinion that America is becoming two separate countries. It is becoming a country of haves and have-nots. And if you look at why people are angry, why there's so much polarization and vitriol in the world around us today, I think it is because we are coming to the conflict of haves and have-nots. We are coming to a world where people cannot be unified because of these economic differences. And I personally have tried, in the small capacity that I am capable of doing, to fight against that kind of inequality. You see, I wanted to start a Represent.us club or union at our school. And my school is actually, albeit a rather large school, not a very rich one. We actually are a Title II school, and debate in our school isn't huge. I'm the first person at my school, as I'm aware, to go through our debate team to a national competition. And I've fought to get more funding for our debate team. So I think that if we are really serious about making America a better place, we have to make America a more equal place, a fairer place. And because social media is the only way I see of doing that, I have a fundamental belief that the affirmative is the correct side to take here.
Thank you both.
Can I have the remainder of my prep time? Ronald Reagan believed that America is a country that is more an idea than a place. It is the idea that all men were created equal, especially in front of the law and in front of our democratic process. We no longer live in a country which supports those ideals. We live in a country that is slowly and steadily approaching oligarchy. And I do not want our country to become one where the people are not represented. And because social media fights against that fundamental problem, I believe it is strengthening our democracy. The core of my opponent's argument is that misinformation is bad and that emotions are bad, and while I agree with the first, I cannot agree with the second. And while misinformation can be solved for by developing new algorithms and is currently being solved for today, We can only implement a government that truly represents the people if we are to fire the emotions, to rally the people behind the movement of anti-corruption. And there is no means of doing that as free from corporate control and as effective as social media. Whether it's the mayor of a town near me, whether it is a local government implementing anti-corruption law, or whether it is a state government anti-corruption law. I feel like social media is fundamentally a benefit to our democracy. And while, yes, it's not perfect, nothing is. None of us are. But as we fight harder, as we use it to rally people behind a common goal, I know that it is possible to make our country a better place. You see, I hope you liked my speech and subscribed to my ideas, but that's not what's most important to me today. Even if I lose this debate, I want you guys to go out there and to fight for our rights, to fight for the fundamental idea that our government should represent its people. You can do that very easily by going to represent.us, by using your Facebook account, by following your local governments and your representatives. And if you do that, I'm sure we will have a better country. You see, Ronald Reagan once said that our problem is a structure of government isolated from the thinking and the wishes of the people. And I agree with him there. And while I cannot necessarily do that alone, social media gives me the power to reach out to other people. You know, this debate will be posted on YouTube, and once it's there, other people can see the views I hold. They can think about them, respond to them, and I think grow from them. And if we take that in heart, if we use that to grow as a nation, I know that we will have, that we can have a stronger democracy, and that social media is a fundamental part of that. Thank you.
Is everybody ready? I think we all need to take a step back and think about what democracy actually is. And democracy is a government by the people and for the people. Without a democracy, without the people, we do not have a democracy. And what we have to look at in today's round is that if we affirm today's resolution, we will not have the correct informed people to support our democracy. The first reason for this is because of echo chambers. And what we can see is that these echo chambers actually destroy discourse in today's society. My opponent talks a lot about, throughout this entire round, how algorithms can actually solve this problem and make it so that we do not have these problems anymore. But he never addresses the fact that the minute I see something that I don't like, I can block it and create an echo chamber even smaller, and verify my own views artificially even more that way, which shows you that we're actually destroying discourse in our country, which means we have worse ideas. But the second reason, and in my opinion more important, is that vitriol comes with social media. A big piece of evidence that goes uncontested in today's round is that more than 50% of social media users think that discourse on social media is so much worse, so much vitriolic than in the real world. This evidence is so important because it shows you that people do not like communicating on social media because it makes them disgusted with politics. And this is where the Davis evidence is really important, and this goes to the heart of democracy. What the Davis evidence says is that because people are so disgusted with political discourse on social media, they've stopped participating. Think about the ramifications of that. One platform, social media, can make it so that people are so disgusted with political discourse in this country that they no longer want to participate. Without participation, without the people, there is no democracy. And I think that's something that we all need to think about. The third issue in today's round is inaccurate information. I want you to all think about how you make a decision when you go to vote for a candidate. All of you try to make the most informed decision that you possibly can so that our country can succeed. But how would you feel if you found out that you made that decision based on information that wasn't true? Well, this happened to a lot of people in the 2016 election. In fact, 1/3 of the top 200 stories were inaccurate on Facebook. That shows you how powerful these social media outlets are, social media networks are in creating misinformation and spreading misinformation. And the last reason that you should vote negative is because the only way to solve campaign finance is by negating. I'd like to remind you that he says in his own case that the majority of social media users are on the lower side of the socioeconomic spectrum, which means they can't even make donations to combat the problem that he discusses. So the best way to solve campaign finance is to reduce polarization and implement legislation that regulates it. Thank you.
Okay, so we are going to take just a little break before we announce our finalists. Sorry to our finalists who have to sit there. They are very anxious to know what the results of our judges and our voting are going to indicate. But before we do that, we're going to invite to the stage a speaker who is no stranger to the idea of what it means to be a powerful and effective communicator. So let me introduce to you Miss Mary McMurray.
What a hard act to follow. Thanks, guys. Wow. Thank you, Tony, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library Foundation for hosting us all in this beautiful venue tonight. It's an honor to be a part of this incredible event and to be surrounded by so many distinguished and accomplished debate champions. All of you here today have impressed me so much. Congratulations. You all deserve to be commended. It's really no easy feat to get here, as you all sitting in the front row know. You competed against some of the top debaters in your respective regions and online to get here. You completed hours of debate prep, or if you followed Alex's advice from last night, 30 minutes last night, there you go, of debate prep. And for many of you, you've built on years of debating experience to come here to this national stage. Clearly, it's all paid off. Because here you are in this spectacular venue at this culmination of this great national debate competition. In other words, it's a pretty big deal. Congratulations to each and every one of you. But in being here, you're taking part in something much, much larger than an impressive national debate competition. You're competing for something much more valuable than the generous scholarships the Reagan Foundation has awarded some of you and is about to award a couple of you. In participating in the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation's Great Communicator Debate Series, you're now joining part of the mission of the presidential libraries and foundations. You see, at the heart of the presidential library system is a single joint mission: to educate and inspire the next generation of citizens. It doesn't matter if you work for a Republican president like Ronald Reagan, or if you work for a Democratic president like Harry Truman. Every presidential library and foundation all participate in this shared mission of teaching civics and inspiring citizens of all ages to fulfill their civic duty. And educating and inspiring citizens is a really crucial task, especially today when surveys show that millions of Americans are unfamiliar with how our government works. I know those people probably aren't in the room today, but surveys show that less than 30% of 4th, 8th, and 12th grade students are proficient in civics. Don't worry, it's not just the young people. Unfortunately, surveys also show that only 1/3 of adults can name all 3 branches of government. It's a major problem. And this is a major problem because a lack of civic knowledge and leadership leaves citizens of all ages without the tools necessary to make sense of and effectively engage in our system of self-government. Emphasis on self there. Whether it's awareness of the branches of government or more sophisticated concepts of government policies and procedures, this lack of understanding about our government promotes distrust among citizens when we so desperately need to be willing to work together. And it also disaffects citizens when we need their votes and voices more than ever. Today's lack of civic awareness and engagement is, quite frankly, a crisis for our democracy. This is what you were debating here tonight. Think about it. Without participation in our democracy, what happens to it? What happens to our freedoms? What happens to our ideals? What happens to the legacy of America? A thriving democracy demands that citizens are well informed about our government and that citizens are committed to participating in it. Harry Truman knew this. In 1950, right before the midterm elections, he delivered an address in his hometown of Independence, Missouri. He was dedicating a replica of the Liberty Bell that still stands in front of the Truman Library today. In his speech right before the midterms, he calls on all Americans, not just Democrats, he's calling on Republicans and people who haven't identified with the party to participate in our democracy. He says, if we are to enjoy and defend our freedom at home, we must exercise our right to vote. No democracy will long remain effective if its citizens do not take an active part in our democracy. Our country is no exception. At a time when the world was engrossed in a fight between freedom and communism, Truman knew that the greatest battle lay not in Eastern Europe or Korea or at other hotspots around the world. No, the #1 battle of the Cold War took place right here in America, where the beneficiaries of freedom and democracy had to engage in our system of self-government in order to preserve it and protect it from the many threats it faced, and to inspire people around the world to want to have a government like ours. As Harry Truman said, voting is not only a duty, it is not only a right, it is a duty, a serious patriotic duty. It's not just Truman who thought this. President Reagan echoed this sentiment in one of his most iconic speeches when he warned Americans, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. That's why the presidential library system as a whole is working actively to combat this crisis in civic education. And in my opinion, some of the best programs for engaging, robust, and transformative civics education occur right here in this building, and also at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum in Independence. The Truman Library was the first presidential library built under the Presidential Libraries Act, and it opened way back in 1957. And from the time that building opened until 1966, Harry Truman himself worked in that building 5 days a week. When he was in his offices, he worked on his memoirs, he met with dignitaries and heads of state. He built the Truman Library Institute, thanks Harry for the job, and that's the nonprofit partner of the Truman Library. But his very favorite thing to do, something he was notorious for doing while working as presidential library, was taking over school tours. Would your students like 20 minutes with me to learn about the presidency and the government? He'd ask any teacher he could find. I love that he would ask, as if any teacher would ever say no to a former president standing in front of them wanting to educate and inspire students. But time and time again, Truman did this, taking over tours, sharing his knowledge and his passion for democracy with our students. Today on a wonderful tour I got to go on to this beautiful presidential library, I learned that Ronald Reagan did that too. Pretty great. And in Harry Truman's impromptu lectures, you can see that his vision for his presidential library. Not that it be a place to glorify him, he wanted it to be what he called a classroom for democracy. He wanted his presidential library to serve as a place where citizens could learn about and be inspired by American history and government, and to hopefully inspire him to participate and one day lead it. To fulfill Harry Truman's noble dream, the Truman Library and Truman Library Institute launched something called the White House Decision Center way back in 1999. It's a recreated West Wing of the White House where students or participants take on the role of Truman and his key advisors. They get to analyze now declassified materials those advisors would have read, and they work as a team to develop a solution to one of the many crises Harry Truman himself faced. They're not done yet. Then they have to go in front of the White House press corps where they defend their decision. We actually have a White House DC alum sitting right up there in the front row. There we go. And since the time that the White House Decision Center opened its doors, we've had nearly 90,000 people come through and take on the challenge of decision making at the highest levels. These include people like senior military officials, officers, officials from the State Department and the CIA, corporate leaders from around the region. But the vast majority of the people who participate in the White House Decision Center are students grades 6 through 12. And let me tell you, it's the students who come up with the most creative, engaging, and well thought out plans to end the war against Japan, address civil rights in the post-war military, develop a response to the end of the British mandate in Palestine,
overcome the Soviets' blockade of Berlin, or develop a response to the North Koreans crossing into South Korea. Pretty heavy stuff for 6th through 12th graders. And here they are coming up with these sophisticated plans by the end of the day. But when they walk in, you wouldn't really know. Many of them walk in slouched over. They look disengaged. Some of them seem scared. It's a hard task. And still others are panicked because we take their cell phones away from them. They didn't have those in the 1940s and 50s. And they're like, what will we do without those for a few hours? But as they go through the day and they have the fate of the free world in their hands, they're being treated as key decision makers. They're being called General, Madam President, Mr. or Madam Secretary. They begin to engage in ways that surprise themselves and their teachers. On my first year working as the director of the White House Decision Center, I saw 2 teachers high-five in the hallway. I'm like, what's this about? So I went down and I asked them. And they said, oh my gosh, a student we've had for years, we've never heard her speak. She's talking now at the table. And as if she knew that what they were about to brag on, at the second they stopped saying that, I heard her slap the table and say, no, you must understand, and then go into details about the Berlin airlift. I said, that girl? And they said, yeah, she never speaks. So at the end of the day, I had to ask her, what happened to you? I heard you were really shy in class. And she said, I didn't know I had it in me. But the stakes were so high, I couldn't be quiet. She clearly got the sense that democracy needed her that day. More than engaging in this crisis decision-making, students also get a spark of inspiration, that sense of purpose that tells them that their voice matters in our democracy. And more than that, that it's necessary. We had a middle schooler come through who wrote a letter afterwards. And she said in her letter that she had always wanted to be president of the United States ever since her preschool voted her most likely to be president of the United States. Unfortunately, since then, she wrote, that desire has been growing dim inside of me. Kind of sad for a middle schooler. You'd think they'd still be idealistic, but not this gal. So then she goes on to write, I didn't realize how much the White House Decision Center trip would mean to me, to have the opportunity to have a realistic view of the presidency and to discover what it takes to fill that role. She goes on for a little while longer, thanking us for the exhilarating and unique experience. And then she signs her letter, Sam A., active member of democracy, and then in parentheses, and hopefully future president of the United States. Happy face. And I thought, that's wonderful. That's what we're supposed to be doing here. We also had some high school students that came in. They developed a 9-point response to the North Koreans crossing into South Korea and effectively defended it in a 20-minute press conference. And they did so well that I invited them into my office to take a picture with the seal of the president. And as I'm taking their picture, I said, wow, you all really show great leadership. Do you have a political future in mind and ahead of you? And the young man goes, yes, I'm going to be the future president of the United States. And before I could even say to him, well, that sounds awesome. Good luck to you. The young woman who also played Harry Truman said, not if I get there first. And I can't help but think one day I'll see their faces advising a campaign, running for office, maybe even becoming one of the presidents themselves. But it's not just people who want to be president, although we do have the presidency, and that's a great thing to teach and inspire people with. It also helps inspire people to all the many roles that you can play in our government and democracy. We had a wonderful young man who came through our program who was adopted. He was adopted from a foreign country. And he played the role of Clark Clifford, who was a special counsel to Harry Truman, goes on to advise LBJ. And at the end of the day, he came up to me and he said, I didn't realize all the people that helped the president make decisions. Okay. And he's like, I finally can see a place for myself. He never knew that there was a place for him in government until he got to see the advisors that worked with him. And so it's incredible to think of these kids that I just told you the example of and all the nearly 90,000 White House Decision Center alums answering the calls of our presidential library system and the presidents we represent, our calls to learn about democracy and engage in it. And that's just one program at one presidential library. Here at Reagan, more than 40,000 people participate in the Foundation's education programs each year. 40,000. Now expand that out to all the 13 presidential libraries and the one more that's being built right now. And think about the presidential libraries and their foundations. And I think we can safely say that hundreds of thousands of students are reached each year by the presidential library system. That's hundreds of thousands of people inspired to share their voice and service in our democracy. hundreds of thousands of people who can engage in civil debate and discussion about our democracy, who know the branches of government and our Constitution, as well as their civic duty to participate in it. And that's it. That's the reason why President Truman, President Reagan, and all the presidents focused so intensely on promoting civic engagement. The reason why all 13, soon to be 14 presidential libraries and foundations focus on civic education. It's to light a spark of civic duty and provide the civic education necessary for our democracy to thrive. Without the experiences we give, without the awe that we inspire by walking into a recreated West Wing or a building with an Air Force One in it, how do you get them to say, wow? And if you don't get them to say, wow, how do you get them to want to be part of our democracy? It's these experiences, only available in presidential libraries, that help light that spark. So, as we celebrate all the success today of you great Reagan great communicator debaters, congratulations. I hope you'll leave here inspired to vote, to continue to be active and engaged citizens, and since you're all so clearly capable, to seize the opportunities in front of you and become the next generation of great leaders. Our democracy needs you, and we're waiting for you. Hurry up and grow up. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mary. That was fantastic, fantastic. And I encourage you all to visit and participate in the programs at all the presidential libraries, but especially here and also Truman. If I could invite our other final round judges to come up on stage, we are now going to announce we're going to honor all of our participants today. And since one of our final round judges was the audience, I am going to choose a token audience member to come up on stage and help award and I'm looking in the audience, maybe someone who finished second place in this competition a couple of years ago as a runner-up, Talise, who's participated. Let's give Talise a big hand. Talise is going to come up and represent the audience. Talise is very happy with me right now. Welcome back, Talise. We always like to see Talise around here. Okay, so what we will do is that we want to honor all of our participants. And so each one, we'll ask you to come up on stage here. We have a trophy for you. The first 8 of you who we are going to call are our national finalists. Each of you will be receiving a $1,000 scholarship, as well as a trophy, which is worth at least $1,001. They're beautiful and finely crafted right here in America. So, first of all, please come to the stage, Bridget Rodriguez. Bridget is a rising junior at downtown Magnet High School in Los Angeles, California, and when not debating, she enjoys playing the violin, sewing, and writing, and she plans to major in international relations. Her dream school is the University of Southern California. Fight on. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And then if you want to be in the middle for the photo, there you go. Here, Katie. Oh, sorry. Next up, Mr. Theodore Wong. Teddy is a rising senior at San Marino High School in San Marino, California. When off the debate stage, he has found time to visit over 20 different countries. In college, he plans on studying public policy or government. Congratulations. Next up, Elora Swoboda. Elora is a rising senior at Lorena High School in Thousand Oaks, California, is an NSDA Academic All-American, a 2-time LD California State and NCFL qualifier, and has been captain of her debate team for 3 years, mentors and coaches middle school debaters, and teaches at the school's annual speech and debate summer camp. Next up, Mr. Benjamin Shang. Benjamin Benjamin is a rising senior at Bridgewater Raritan High School in Bridgewater, New Jersey, where he's captain of the school's speech and debate team, volunteers as a teaching assistant at his local community center, and interns as a legislative analyst at a research institution. In his spare time, he likes to catch up on sleep and binge watch Netflix. Two activities which don't always go well together. Next up, Kwong Wong. Kwong is a rising junior attending the High School of American Studies in New York City. He loves learning about history, education, and the social sciences, and besides debate, he runs cross-country, compiles his school's online newsletter, and interns at the New York Historical Society. Next up, Mr. Carlos Gregory. Carlos is a recent graduate of Hendrickson High School in Pflugerville, Texas. In addition to debate, Carlos plays soccer, through which he's been fortunate enough to travel across the country and visit states like Florida, Massachusetts, and California. He will be attending Hofstra University to study biology with a concentration in cell biology. Next up, Ben Goldberg. Ben is a rising senior at Half Hollow Hills High School East in Dix Hills, New York. He will be beginning his third year on the debate team and his first year as debate captain. He has two brothers, Jack and Sam, and this is his first time in California. Next up, Lauren Morgenbesser. Lauren is a rising junior at Harvard Westlake School in Los Angeles, California. In addition to the great communicator debates, she's competed in Lincoln Douglas debate for 3 years. Outside of the debate world, she has traveled to 6 continents. While still undecided about her major, she is interested in possibly majoring in political science or philosophy. Congratulations to each of our national finalists. The next couple of folks here are our quarterfinalists. So they qualified to the quarterfinal round and will each earn a scholarship of $2,000. So first up, Elijah Rojas. Eli is a rising senior at Truman High School in Independence, Missouri. He has yet to solidify his choice university, but will likely major in some variation of communications since he spends the majority of his time pretending to be a politician. Next, Miss Emma Lynn. Emma is a recent graduate from Carroll Senior High School in Southlake, Texas. Other than speech and debate, she enjoys hiking national parks and volunteering at a local cat shelter. She will be attending Harvard University, concentrating in government and philosophy with a secondary concentration in Mandarin Chinese. Next up is Quentin Levin. Quentin is a recent graduate of the Potomac School in McLean, Virginia. Beyond his life in the debate world, he has been elected to public office twice. He will be attending American University in Washington, D.C. with an interdisciplinary major in communications, law, economics, and government. And our final quarterfinalist, Christopher Maximus. Chris is a rising junior at Del Barton School in New Jersey, an accomplished speech and debate competitor. He's seen distinction at elite tournaments, including Harvard, the University of Pennsylvania, and Yale. And beyond competition, he hosts his own podcast, Extempolitik, and advocates for increased youth involvement across the political system. And now our semifinalists. Each of our 2 semifinalists will receive a scholarship of $3,500. So first up, Mr. William Porter. William is a recent graduate from Phoenix Country Day School in Phoenix, Arizona. And in between school and constant work for debate, he likes to make cookies. In fact, the cookies throughout the retreat have been prepared by William. Next year, he will be attending Tufts University in Boston, where he plans to study political science and physics. Congratulations, Will. And our other semifinalist, Isabel Lay. Isabel is a rising senior at Central High School in Springfield, Missouri. She loves learning about the world and approaching familiar things from different perspectives, which she tries to accomplish through her favorite pastimes, math, debate, and reading books. And now the moment we have all been waiting for. Actually, I'm going to invite both of our finalists up to the stage for a dramatic moment of anticipation. So both of you, congratulations on an excellent and inspiring final round. So our runner-up, earning a $7,000 scholarship, Sriyash Upadhyay. Yash is a rising I'll come take a picture. Yash is a rising senior at Montgomery Blair High School in Maryland. This summer he will be conducting medical research at the National Institutes of Health and applying to colleges to further pursue his passion for medicine with focuses in computer science and public policy. Congratulations. And that, of course, means that our national champion this year in the 2017 Great Communicator National Championship, by a 4-to-1 vote, Mr. John Magloire. So John is a rising senior at Chaminade High School in Mineola, New York. Outside of the debate world, he enjoys listening to 60s and 70s rock music, no 80s. No 80s, huh? Reagan Library? In college, he pretends to pursue a degree in economics and history. Congratulations to you both.